So good morning to those of you joining us from the Americas. Good afternoon to those of you who are in Europe, the Middle East and Africa. And a special thank you to those of you joining us from parts of Asia and Australasia, as you are making a particular commitment to us to be with us, since for some of you, obviously it's well past your bedtime. So thank you for joining us. I'm delighted to welcome all of you to this year's 2020 Human Rights Centre annual lecture. I am Dr. Andrew Fagan, and I am the director of the Human Rights Centre. I shall be hosting our esteemed speaker today. Many of you will be fully aware of the reputation of the Essex Human Rights Centre. Some of you, however, may not know as much as you ought to about who we are and why we are so special. The HRC is one of the world's oldest and most highly respected academic human rights centre. Since 1982, Essex has spearheaded a great many developments in the theory and the practice of human rights. Many of our staff have occupied and continue to occupy senior positions within a vast array of human rights bodies and institutions. Many of our almost 3,000 human rights alumni have gone on to establish highly successful professional careers in human rights. The Essex HRC has left a very large footprint upon the global human rights community. Throughout the year, we organise a comprehensive programme of talks and events which focus upon the multi- and interdisciplinary theory and practice of human rights. We are presently planning our programme of events for the upcoming academic year. As a consequence of COVID-19, most of our events will be delivered online, as we are doing today. One of the many benefits of delivering our events online is that it enables many more people to attend and engage with the internationally acclaimed theorists and practitioners that contribute to our events. I hope that today's annual lecture will motivate many of you to continue following us and attending subsequent events. The best way to keep up to date, of course, on what the HRC is doing is through following us on Facebook and Twitter. The HRC annual lecture is a showcase event of our year, a highlight of our year. It is intended to raise awareness of particularly topical human rights issues and challenges for as wide and diverse an audience as possible. We hope that our annual lectures will provoke many of you to think more deeply about human rights and, just as importantly, to inspire many of you to deepen your involvement in human rights. Previous contributors to our annual lecture have included the now UN Secretary General. This year, we are absolutely delighted and honoured to host Dr. Tendayi Achiume, who is Professor of Law at the University of California, Los Angeles School of Law, and a research associate of the African Center for Migration and Society at the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa. She is also the UN Special Rapporteur on contemporary forms of racism, racial discrimination, xenophobia, and related intolerance. And she is the first woman to serve in this role since its creation in 1994. The current focus of her scholarship is the global governance of racism and xenophobia, and the legal and ethical implications of colonialism for contemporary international migration. In 2016, she co-chaired the annual meeting of the American Society of International Law. She is also a recipient of the UCLA Distinguished Teaching Award, the highest university-wide honor for excellence in teaching. Her publications include Migration as Decolonization, the Stanford Law Review, Governing Xenophobia, the Vanderbilt Journal of Transnational Law, Syria, Cost Sharing and the Responsibility to Protect Refugees, in the Minnesota Law Review, and amongst many others, Beyond Prejudice, Structural Xenophobic Discrimination Against Refugees, in the Georgetown Journal of International Law. Given the horrific killing of George Floyd and the subsequent mobilization of popular protest by the Black Lives Matter movement in defense of racial justice and human rights, Dr. Achiume is, I'm sure you'll agree, the perfect choice to present this year's HRC annual lecture. Before I pass the floor to Dr. Achiume, I just need to inform you of some very simple procedural matters. You will be able to raise questions through the chat and Q&A functions throughout the lecture. I would suggest, however, that you refrain from doing so until after Dr. Achiume has concluded her formal lecture. We have a staggering 401 people registered for this particular lecture. It breaks all previous records. I suspect that it will not be possible, therefore, to address all of the questions that you raise. I apologize for that in advance, but we will do our best. I understand that Dr. Achiume will speak for some 40 minutes, 45 minutes, which will then be immediately followed by what I know will be a very engaging Q&A discussion. Anyway, that's enough from me. Dr. Achiume, welcome to Essex, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Andrew, and thank you also to Professor Ahmed Shahid, who's my colleague within the UN system. It's really an honor to be able to deliver this lecture. I'm a very big admirer of the Essex Human Rights Center, and so when I got the invitation, I honestly couldn't believe it. And thank you to all of you who are joining from all over the world for being willing to spend yet another hour and a half in a Zoom meeting. I'm truly honored that you would do this. I wish we could be doing this in person, but doing it online definitely offers new opportunities. So I'm going to make the caveat that I am not the most tech savvy person in the world. My students can attest to this. So I'm going to share my screen so you can see my slides. But I realize that if I do that, I can't see my notes, which I'm going to read if you have the full screen view of my PowerPoint. So I'll share it with you, but unfortunately it will be in the unsatisfactory form of not quite the full thing. So let's see if that will work. All right. Andrew, can you confirm that you can see my slides, even though you probably cannot see them in the full screen mode?
Yeah, I can see them. They're in the preview mode.
Okay, perfect. And is it big enough that you can see the text of the preview in the preview mode? Because I may have to go.
Could be a little bit bigger, Jimmy.
Okay, let me see if I can make it. Sorry, everybody, just bear with me. How is that?
That's better.
Okay, all right. And I wish I could show them to you in the full screen, but then I won't be able to read my notes, in which case it'll just be a waste of everybody's time. And the reason why I'm reading is because I really would like to stick to the 45 minutes so that we have time for Q&A. So to give you an outline of how I'm going to proceed, I'm going to start off by making some initial observations about race and human rights. And then I'm going to turn to the topic of discussion for my lecture today, which is racial borders. And my goal with that is to just consider racial justice in the context of migration and borders, and to share with you some ideas that I'm working on in a forthcoming publication. I want to start off with the words of Deborah Thompson, and this is now going to be the challenge. Andrew, can you confirm that the text is legible?
Yes, it is. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so I'm going to start with the words of Deborah Thompson, who, writing in the fields of international relations, diagnosed her field as suffering from a condition that she terms racial aphasia. And you'll see that this first slide breaks the rules of PowerPoint by having a lot of text on it, but it's a very important quotation that I wanted to be able to share with you. So Deborah Thompson says, she's diagnosing her field with this condition she calls racial aphasia. And she says, this is not the same as amnesia, which indicates some unfortunate series of events that led to an unintentional forgetting of how the modern world system was founded on and continues as a hierarchical racial order. Racial amnesia obscures the power involved in purposeful evasion, suggesting that, like a B-plot movie, we must have accidentally fallen, hit our heads, and forgotten our racist past. Amnesia disavows intent. Aphasia, on the other hand, indicates a calculated forgetting, an obstruction of discourse, language, and speech. International bodies and states alike profess normative and legal commitments to racial equality, while racial stratification persists both between the developed and the developing worlds and within most, if not all, racially heterogeneous societies. White supremacy as a global institution and racism as a pervasive social structure are obscured. As a result, racism is instead reduced to abhorrent individualistic acts or attitudes. The promise of the post-racial society is realized not through reparations or substantive equality, but in the imposition of race-free discourses that keep international and domestic racial orders firmly entrenched. So she made these observations in 2013 about the field of international relations. And I want to talk about how her observations remain valid and applicable to the global human rights system within the United Nations and even among the most influential global human rights organizations and institutes in the world. With few exceptions, they participate in the neglect of what amounts to a calculated forgetting of white supremacy as a global institution and racism as a pervasive social structure, reducing the problem of racism to abhorrent individualistic acts or attitudes, as Deborah Thompson defines the term racial aphasia. And this places an emphasis on punishing or condemning individual acts of prejudice rather than undoing structures of systemic injustice. In some parts of the world, the mere mention of the word race is considered taboo, offensive, outdated, and inherently divisive. A few years ago, some of you may know that France, for example, removed the word race from its constitutional provision on equality and replaced it with sex, on the argument that there were no different races and it's outdated to speak as such. I want to be clear then what I mean in my talk today when I speak of race. So I'm using the term race and the term that critical race theorists in the United States have and many others in different fields. And here I have a definition that's provided by Ian Haney Lopez in his book, White by Law, which focuses on the legal construction of race. And it's a book I recommend for any law students who are interested in law's role in the construction of the meaning of race. And so the term race, Ian Haney Lopez tells us, refers to the historically contingent social systems of meaning that attach to elements of morphology and ancestry. And what you see in this definition is that it unequivocally rejects the scientifically and morally discredited notion of biological races, and instead recognizes race as a potent social construction. It recognizes that the social construction of race is informed by physical features and lineage, not because features and lineage are a function of racial variation, but because societies invest morphology and ancestry with social meaning. At the same time, race is by no means simply or even mostly about physical attributes such as skin color. It's centrally about the legal, political, and economic meaning of being characterized or categorized as Black, white, brown, or any other racial designation. There's a tendency to treat race as mostly an identity attribute of individuals or a group, and at the same time to ignore the ways in which race operates as a structure of power, according to which privileges and rights are allocated. And Anibal Quijano reminds us that race today is the product of centuries-long colonial intervention and exploitation, during which race, and I quote, became the fundamental criterion for the distribution of the world population into ranks, places, and roles in society's structure of power. In the colonial context, race structured rights and privileges on hierarchical terms determined by white supremacy. Although formal decolonization has occurred in most of the world, race persists as a neo-colonial structure, one that still allocates benefits and privileges to the advantage of some and the disadvantage of others, largely along the same geopolitical and racial lines that characterize the European colonial project. This is by no means a totalizing account of the meaning of race, and there's many different ways of understanding what this term means. But it's in this structural sense, for the most part, that I will use the term race for the purposes of our conversation. In my experiences as a human, as an academic, and as a UN independent expert, my sense is that this structural and historicized understanding of race and racial subordination is completely missing or is left out of mainstream human rights discourse. And sometimes this neglect or this racial aphasia will manifest as colorblindness or a commitment to not seeing race, where it's considered a positive and fair intervention that seeks to treat everybody the same, and so you ignore race as a way of doing so. It can also manifest as neglect of racial justice and equality issues. So human rights organizations and institutions will regularly have a programmatic focus on gender as a structure of oppression, warranting some intervention. And that approach is important, not only because gender itself is a structure of oppression, but because of the way that it intersects with racial oppression as well. But oftentimes, even where gender is considered, racial justice will be marginal. And for those of you who have or are studying human rights, I would ask you to think about how much time, if any, is devoted in your syllabi to the International Convention for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, the first of the core UN human rights treaties that comes even before the ICCPR and ICESCA at the behest of formerly colonized nations. Even among self-styled, well-intentioned actors within the human rights and humanitarian spheres, colorblindness that is connected to racial aphasia has been the norm. It can manifest as a trivialization of the relevance of race. So sometimes it'll be its race and not class. So if we focus purely on socioeconomic status, that will resolve all of the relevant issues, or just outright denialism. There is no racism or racial discrimination. Typically, these sorts of perspectives are closely associated with privilege of different kinds. The privilege might be racial privilege, so maybe being white and thus being largely oblivious to the ways in which race, especially non-whiteness, can undercut access to fundamental human rights, or even just make your life meaningfully uncomfortable. It might be gender privilege, so being a cis man or woman in a society where racial and gender discrimination are intersectional in ways that make women of color more vulnerable to certain types of human rights violations. Or it might be class privilege, being sufficiently wealthy as to be largely and even not, if not mostly fully insulated from systemic racism in access to public services or in other arenas. I could talk at length about the causes of racial aphasia in human rights and humanitarian advocacy. But with the time I have, my aim is simply to put it on the proverbial table as an issue that requires urgent attention, even among groups and individuals who understand themselves as the vanguard of defending human rights locally, nationally, or globally. Instead, what I want to do for the rest of my lecture is focus on borders and migration and focus on racial aphasia in the context of borders and migration, and say that and make the point that it characterizes most debates about migrants and refugees. And in my talk, I'll be focusing mostly on Europe in light of the location of my hosts for this lecture. I should note that many of the insights that I make about Europe are applicable to other parts of the world as well. So my next slide is an image of the Aquarius. And in June 2018, the Aquarius, a search and rescue sea vessel jointly operated by 2 international NGOs, rescued 629 African migrants off of the coast of Libya. It was denied permission to dock by Italy and Malta, the 2 closest countries. The Italian Interior Minister at the time, whose party had successfully been elected on a platform that was strongly anti-immigrant and even xenophobic, defended his country's decision as a justified response to illegal immigration. The French president publicly criticized Italy's rejection of Aquarius refugees and migrants, but this criticism belied the similarly aggressive anti-immigrant and anti-refugee policies that even more centrist European nations have adopted, including through the European Union. The EU has had a policy of cooperation with Libyan Coast Guard to prevent migrants from leaving Libyan shores, and a number of European countries have taken steps to prohibit disembarkation of migrant ships and even to criminalize humanitarian support for those in peril at sea. In 2018, Amnesty International published a report attributing the rise in the number of people held in Libyan detention centers and the more than doubling of deaths in detention there to EU-funded migrant interception efforts in the Mediterranean. Now, this European approach to migration governance has been the subject of very strong critique, including among human rights advocates within and beyond Europe. But this critique, especially among advocacy organizations pushing for more humane approaches to migration, what's notable about it, or one of the things that's notable about it, is the absence of a racial justice critique. And so the critique has focused on due process rights of refugees and migrants, their inhumane treatment, and the dangers and pressures that force people to move in the first place. But nothing much on racial justice. And I would say even the legal scholarship on European migration governance has largely failed to engage the racial justice and racial equality implications of these policies and practices. And I want to pause for a second to explain why I center the international human rights frame in my analysis of migration-related discourses and in Europe and the rest of the world generally. So within the global system, it's the language and the law of human rights that anchors rights-based critique of borders right now. And most recently, for example, in December 2018, UN member states adopted the Global Compact on Migration, which was heralded as the first international agreement governing migration generally, although there's a prior treaty that specifically focuses on the human rights of migrant workers and their families. And if you look at the text of the Global Compact, it makes very clear that human rights are central to the analysis. So it says, the Global Compact is based on international human rights law and upholds the principles of non-aggression and non-discrimination. By implementing the Global Compact, we ensure, and the we here is states, effective, respective protection and fulfillment of the human rights of all migrants, regardless of their migration status across all stages of the migration cycle. We also reaffirm the commitment to eliminate all forms of discrimination, including racism, xenophobia, and intolerance against migrants and their families. And so within the Global Compact, we see how the international human rights law principles today are intended to provide the normative anchors for just migration law and policy all over the world, including from the perspective of equality and non-discrimination commitments. In short, international human rights is the discourse that matters, and one that will only matter more if people continue to move as they do now. And so for human rights scholars, advocates, implementers, an urgent challenge is to articulate exactly what a human rights approach to migration entails, including where racial justice and equality are concerned. But you might ask, what does racial justice and equality have to do with borders and migration? And now what I want to do is just take us very briefly back to the colonial history of contemporary borders. And for any historians who may be listening in, and for everybody else, I'll confess that this is a very brief and cursory overview. And the scholars who have really mapped out in a fair amount of detail the colonial history of contemporary borders, a history that I would say is typically left out of how we teach students and how we talk about borders in the contemporary moment, which is really a tragedy. And so the history that I will be speaking to will highlight the way international law and legal theory have played crucial roles in defending international mobility when this mobility has been that of whites. And conversely, it's firmly constrained this mobility when non-whites have attempted to exercise freedom of movement on their own terms. And so the picture that emerges from this history that I'm going to share with you very briefly is that the history of freedom of international movement is unfortunately the history of the racial allocation of the privilege of international mobility. Consider that between the 19th and the first half of the 20th century alone, approximately 62 million Europeans emigrated to colonial territories across the world. Historians note that the scale and consequences of even just British Empire migration between 1815 and the 1960s explains much about the modern world. And today, the most commonly contested and even widely opposed category of international migrant is that of the economic migrant, a term that is typically used to refer to those who move in search of better economic or other opportunities. And it's a racialized term. The term economic migrant is a racialized term that's usually used to undercut claims to legitimate inclusion and admission, and that's reserved for migrants and refugees in the Mediterranean, for those at the southern borders of the US, the image that I showed you of the Aquarius, whether or not there are people on that ship who have legitimate claims to refugee status, oftentimes in media and popular discourse, you'll see such migrants being referred to as economic migrants in a derogatory and racialized way. But if you look at the history, it's European colonial migrants that were the quintessential and original economic migrants. And in striking contrast to the mortal costs that international law today imposes on non-European economic migrants, European colonial economic migration and economic migrants benefited from an international legal and imperial regime that facilitated, encouraged, and celebrated white economic migration. And so historians Marjorie Harper and Stephen Constantine note, for example, that British colonial migration, quote, of all types was an important element in the transformation of huge spaces of the overseas empire into primary producing regions for those principal markets, for the primary regions whose principal markets were in the UK and other parts of Europe, end quote. Some such migrants moved permanently, establishing permanent residence in colonial territories, but many others were migrants whose careers as businessmen or military men or public colonial administrators meant that they spent much of their working lives overseas in colonial territories. During the colonial era, Europeans, including those who settled in the Americas, Australia, Canada, Africa, Asia, migrated in the absence of the restrictive immigration regimes that are enforced today. colonial economic migration brought with it genocide, enslavement, exploitation, all of which transformed the world and laid the foundations and the basis for our current global order. Any large-scale international movement of non-whites during the colonial period worked differently, however. The history of slavery is, among other things, the history of brutal forced relocation of Africans, especially to different corners of the colonial empire for the benefit of settler colonial exploitation. With slavery's abolition in the first half of the 19th century, the global imperial economy could no longer rely on the international trade in enslaved Africans for its labor. This shift thrust Indians into the role of what historians have described as the global working class of the British Empire, as millions were contracted as laborers, as indentured laborers to work across the British colonies in the Caribbean, Southeast Asia, South Africa, and the Pacific. Non-white international migration of significant scale to Europe and across its settler and exploitation colonies then operated according to the logics that benefited the metropolitan and colonial European empires through colonial subordination of non-Europeans. Socio-legal scholar Radhika Mongia, in her work on colonial Indian migration, shows how, in fact, it was the relatively modest increase in the numbers of free Indian migration to Canada that resulted in the first time in the introduction of a passport system for Indian migration. The arrival of about 2,000 Indians in Canada in 1906 generated racial anxiety within Canada at a time when explicitly racial restrictions on mobility stood in an untenable tension with notions of British subjecthood across the British Empire. As a means of restricting migration by free Indians, Canada in 1907 proposed the introduction of a passport system, according to which free Indians would only be admitted if they possessed a passport. But passports would only be selectively issued by the colonial Indian administration so as to curtail this form of international migration. This system became law in India in 1915, when departing British India without a passport if you were Indian was a criminal offense. Mongia's work shows how passports, which today are considered neutral machinery of migration governance, in this colonial period functionally emerged as a crucial technology that achieved racialized exclusion without explicit reliance on race, because nationality played the mediating function. On the basis of passport nationality, white settler nations and even metropolitan Europe could restrict the immigration of non-whites. By the early 20th century then, nationality became an efficient means of tethering non-whites to their regions or countries of ancestry and ensuring their exclusion from white settler and metropolitan colonial nations. More generally, the period between the mid-19th and the early 20th century is the period that gave rise to the foundation of the international migration regimes that dominate the world today. In that period, immigration restrictions essentially implemented a regime of racial segregation on international scale. In 1855, the British self-governing colony of Victoria, which would later become part of the Federation of Australia, introduced the first immigration restriction in its Immigration Restriction Act, as European miners and colonists rallied against Chinese who sought their fortunes in Victorian oil fields. This law defined an immigrant as any male adult native of China or its dependencies, or any islands in the Chinese seas, or any person born of Chinese parents. In other words, in this early definition of immigrant, the aim was to exclude a particular racial group. Europeans, who were by no means indigenous to Australia, did not count as immigrants. In 1882, the United States adopted the Chinese Exclusion Act prohibiting the immigration of Chinese natives. In their seminal historical analysis of race and immigration control, Marilyn Lake and Henry Reynolds include the following quotation from Theodore Roosevelt's speech, which he made in 1897. And the quotation says, "The ordinary man of adventurous tastes and a desire to get all out of life that can be gotten is beyond measure better off than were his forefathers of 1, 2, or 3 centuries back. He can travel around the world, he can dwell in any country he wishes, he can explore strange regions. Yet this privilege of traveling, dwelling, exploring, international mobility and international migration essentially, in this period were firmly consolidated as privileges of whiteness." Legal scholar James Nafziger has shown how during this very same period at the turn of the 19th century into the 20th, jurists and scholars also advanced an absolutist conception of nation-state sovereignty. The idea that the sovereignty of a nation state as a legal doctrine accords nation states the rights to exclude non-nationals on their own terms. The Chinese exclusion cases decided by the US Supreme Court also in the 1880s are part of this legacy, and the context and the purpose of much of this work included legitimating the exclusion of free non-white migrants, especially excluding them from white settler colonies of the British Empire, in order to maintain levels of racial purity and prosperity deemed inconsistent with the emerging patterns of free non-white migration at the time. Even through the 20th century, the use of migration governance to achieve racial exclusion persisted as first world states reformed national immigration laws and international and bilateral law to maintain control over non-white migration. I use these categories, first and third world, as geopolitical categories to refer to former European colonial powers, including their settler colonies on the one hand, and former colonized territories on the other. Naturalization laws in the first world evolved to ensure the primacy of European bloodline in access to nationality. Again, take the example of Britain. So prior to 1962, British subjects were at least in principle free from immigration control, irrespective of where in the British Empire they were born. So for example, my ancestors in Southern Africa were considered British subjects. This was partly sustained by a Commonwealth ideology in which all British subjects were equal regardless of race. And this doctrine of solidarity held as long as free movement to metropolitan Britain was from its old or white dominions, so Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. With the changing racial composition of the Commonwealth and of Commonwealth migrants came racialized border closures. So-called new Commonwealth migration to metropolitan Britain outpaced the rest as countries became decolonized and non-whites were moving around in greater numbers. And after a while, it outpaced the rest and precipitated a debate within Britain and a controversy regarding who ought to be considered a citizen and what rights and privileges the status of being a British subject should entail. This, quote, rising tide of colored immigration, unquote, produced anti-immigrant rhetoric in Britain, including with regard to perceived but unfounded socioeconomic strain, which loosened restrictions on, which they feared loosened restrictions on immigration would impose on the nation. This rhetoric bolstered the adoption of the Commonwealth Immigrants Act of 1962, which largely limited immigration by Commonwealth passport holders to skilled individuals and those tied to specific employers who had secured approval for their employment. It nonetheless permitted the entry of a category termed patrials, those whose parents and grandparents were born in the United Kingdom. Patrials were eligible for UK passports, could vote and run for office, and were also entitled to the same benefits of the European community as UK nationals. A crucial characteristic of the patrial category, as Randall Hansen has noted, is that the vast majority who fell within it were white. Thus, notwithstanding the history of free and assisted British colonial emigration, as a result of which metropolitan Britain and its white settler colonies reaped the full benefit of third world subordination, today the UK operates one of the strictest migration policies in the Western world. These restrictions were formalized beginning in Britain in the 1970s, and similar shifts had already occurred across all other Western European states. My point here is that the history shows that first world nation states' borders and immigration regimes that we take for granted today as race-neutral entitlements of state sovereignty, were erected to keep non-whites out of territory reserved for European prosperity, including in the settler colonies of the US, Australia, and Canada. Okay, so how does international migration and international mobility work today? And by today, we can talk about how the COVID pandemic has shifted some of the dynamics that I'm talking about in my presentation. And I hope in Q&A, somebody will ask me a question that allows me to reflect a little bit on some of the observations that I've been making during this pandemic about how borders continue to operate in a racial nature, but I'll set that to the side. And just note that we live in a world of migration governance and technologies that achieve racialized exclusion and containment in ways that preserve dynamics that originated in the colonial era that I was just describing. The much reviled illegal immigrant is a racialized subject the world over. Whether we're talking about so-called illegal immigrants in the United States, in Europe, or even in South Africa, illegality of migration in its most contested and polarizing form typically implicates the movement of non-whites. And this is not because there are no white unauthorized migrants. That's just not the case. It is the illegality of non-white migration that tends to be the most contested and polarizing. Race is absolutely a factor in determining who is subject to xenophobic backlash. And then this in part has to do with the theory of nation state sovereignty that so widely and so deeply informs law, policy, philosophy, and even lay sensibilities about who can move, who can belong, and on what terms. Political theorist Charles Mills theorizes racial privilege as a form of political domination and racism as a political system, a particular power structure of formal or informal rule, socioeconomic privilege, and norms for the differential distribution of material wealth and opportunities, benefits and burdens, rights and duties. Furthermore, he argues that conceptually, white supremacy should be thought of as itself a political system. The logic of the system, and I quote, the differential privileging of whites as a group with respect to non-whites as a group, the extrapolation of their bodies, land, and resources, and denial of equal socioeconomic opportunities to them, end quote. The operation of this system is neither based on nor requires the intentional participation of all whites, but all whites are nonetheless its beneficiaries. Crucially, Mills articulates white supremacy as an analytically distinct global project, a racial project that operates within and through empire on the basis of other social categories apart from race, but one that requires us to treat race as an independent axis of analysis as well, and as being important for the explanatory power that it gives us for understanding subordination and hierarchy in society. In my work that I'm focusing on now, I argue that for non-whites in much of the world, their very race itself operates as a border on account of the historical and continuing social and political construction of whiteness. And so at least one way to think of a border, and indeed the way that interests me the most here, is that it's a site or a process through which inclusion or exclusion can be enforced. In other words, borders are a site among whose purposes or functions is to enforce exclusion or inclusion. And you might think of a wall, a border wall in this way. National borders work this way. Territorial borders function as sites where territorial exclusion can be achieved. And political borders, which I understand to include institutions such as citizenship, immigration status of various kinds, these political borders themselves also enforce and achieve exclusion and exclusion from various benefits of national membership. And so if we think about borders in this way, race, and specifically non-whiteness, operates according to a similar bordering function. If you're non-white, one function or operation of being socially constructed as such is that your non-whiteness enforces exclusion. If borders interrupt, curtail, regulate, or govern mobility, admission, and inclusion, then race functions as a border where non-whiteness enforces presumptive closure. Non-whiteness means national borders follow you because they are a part of you or the social construction of you, long after formal screening at an airport or at a land border, and even in spite of formal authorization. Immigration enforcement within national territories relies heavily on racial profiling. And in both the first and the third world, whiteness reliably functions as a shield against enforcement of exclusion. And racial profiling only works because of the latent border of non-whiteness. And I would argue that whiteness doesn't operate in the same way. It's not a border in the sense of being a site of national exclusion or enforcement. Instead, it facilitates self-determination, mobility, and extraction. And so for those of you who've had the experience of traveling internationally while Black or Arab or Indian, the way that I'm talking about race as a border will be intuitive to you. And I'm reminded of a trip that I did in my official capacity, actually as Special Rapporteur to Morocco, where in traveling south and then north through the country, it was clear that the closer you got to Europe, immigration enforcement meant that there were fewer Black bodies just on the streets, because as they got closer to Europe, there was a suspicion that was, you know, shared by Morocco and by Europe in Morocco, that those people would be trying to move illegally to the rest of Europe. And so as you move through geographic space, you see fewer and fewer Black bodies, because those bodies have been sites of enforcement of exclusion. So the photo that began my slideshow, which I'm hoping you can see here, is taken at a funeral. And just about every talk that I give about borders and migration, I share this image because it's one that I find perpetually haunting. In November 2017, media outlets reported the death of 26 Nigerian girls and women aged between 14 and 18, whose bodies were found floating in the Mediterranean. There were many more individuals on the boat that carried these girls, including some survivors, but only 2 of the 26 who died were identified by the time the Italian government buried them: a Muslim woman whose name was Marianne Shako and a Christian woman whose name was Asata Asara, and both of them were pregnant, and there was speculation that they had been raped along the journeys, either through Libya or on their way from Nigeria trying to reach Europe. One of the survivors interviewed stated that the motivations for most of the women on the boat from Nigeria was the search for jobs. And I've been focusing on racial borders, but we might think about racial borders intersecting with gender borders in the example of these Nigerian girls and women. And so one of the survivors interviewed stated that the motivation for most of the women on the boat from Nigeria was the search for jobs. And it's important to note that Europe, like much of the first world, is powered by an economic system that is predicated on labor migration, arguably even unauthorized labor migration. But rather than provide legal pathways for this type of migration, European nations, with the support of African governments, their response has been to double down on the securitization of European borders and even of African borders to keep migrants, African migrants, out of Europe. And in the context of passports, visa regimes, border externalization and securitization policies that in effect privilege first world international mobility, the reality is that the mortal cost of international mobility is largely a non-white problem. And so it's neither arbitrary nor coincidental that the 26 girls who perished in this tragedy were Black. And this is because, in effect, Europe's borders are racial borders, as are international borders more generally. And the following quotation from Nicholas de Genova, I think, puts the point perfectly. So he says, Europe's deadly borders must be understood as racial borders. The physical barricading and even more lethal policing of Europe's borders likewise signify an abundantly racialized affair. Rather than perceiving the brute racial post-coloniality of Europe's borders as merely exclusionary matter, it's vital that we discern the ways that this profoundly racialized system of immigration and asylum operates, in fact, in a perfectly predictable way as a machine of inclusion, albeit a form of inclusion that is always one of racialized, post-colonial, illegalized labor subordination. And you might think about reliance of parts of Europe, including Southern Europe, on unauthorized labor to harvest crops and in other parts of their industry as well. This sociological and political critique requires legal articulation, including through the language of human rights, if the framework of human rights is to maintain its value and its credibility. There was widespread outcry at the death of these girls when they passed away, but at no point did a racial critique of their death emerge, including within the human rights community. Yet the fact remains that first world citizens have far greater capacity for lawful international mobility relative to their third world counterparts, even holding constant or setting aside questions of personal financial means. One's nationality determines the range of one's freedom of movement in ways that completely belies frequent claims that assert or imply that all persons are equally without the right of freedom of international movement in our global order. This is in part because of the robust web of multilateral and bilateral visa agreements that privilege first world passport holders and pre-authorize their movement across the globe. In a global ranking of passports, according to the extent of entitlements to visa-free travel, first world countries dominate the top and third world countries dominate the bottom. Thus, for many, place of birth alone determines whether or not the act of moving across national borders will be a matter of life and death. And because of the persisting racial demographics that distinguish the first world from the third, most whites then enjoy dramatically greater rights to freedom of international movement than most non-whites. Where Europe is concerned, its border externalization practices only exacerbate the situation. Border externalization policies are policies that governments use to project their national borders beyond their national territories. And examples include, for example, the 2016 EU-Turkey deal, through which the EU pays Turkey to prevent the arrival of Syrian refugees on its territories. Other examples include the EU 2016 partnership agreement framework, through which it makes development aid and EU foreign relations conditional on African governments' agreement to cooperate with the EU's migration and control objectives. In these and in other ways, Europe is quite literally in control of borders outside of its territory. These border externalization processes have been critiqued using the human rights and refugee law frameworks on the basis of due process and other grounds, but not from a racial justice or equality perspective. Yet border externalization amounts to the projection of national borders extraterritorially with the effect of ensuring regional containment of undesired migrants and refugees and consolidating national immigration regimes that de facto allocate mobility and migration on a racial basis. For some, restrictive migration policies of first world nation states are defensible because of the belief that the right to exclude is an ethical sovereign entitlement. I believe that such arguments, especially where Europe is concerned, can only be sustained by a profoundly ahistorical analysis of Europe's relationship to Africa and other parts of the world. And I've argued elsewhere in my work for a different way of thinking about sovereignty, and one that in which I argue that on account of the failures of formal decolonization, former colonial nations actually have no right to exclude citizens of formerly colonized territories. But my point here is that the front lines of white supremacy and racism in Europe and in the global governance of migration generally are by no means confined to explicit racism and xenophobia of the far right. They include institutional frameworks, political and legal discourses that are facially race neutral, but that continue to operate according to racialized logic. The result is that where racial justice and equality are concerned, the threat is also embodied in even liberal discourses and regimes that we treat as largely race neutral. The fitness of human rights to serve as a meaningful language of fairness, justice, and dignity for all person, I would argue, depends in part on whether the language of human rights can address the racial operation of borders that I've attempted to highlight. So in conclusion, I want to talk about where we find ourselves now. We find ourselves in the midst of what might be an inflection point, a fundamental shift in direction when it comes to the racial aphasia of the global human rights system and the global order more generally. And note that I'm expressing the possibility and not the certainty of an inflection point. We're in a moment of possible profound change triggered, among other things, by, as Andrew mentioned, the brutal murder of George Floyd in Minneapolis in May, which has triggered, in the context also of a COVID pandemic, which has been one that I think has also made manifest the true meaning of race as a structure. Transnationally, we've witnessed an unprecedented rise or social mobilization of multiracial, multi-ethnic coalitions protesting against systemic racism in a global movement, I would argue. And we see the phrase Black Lives Matter being repeated in UN spaces like the Human Rights Council and the European Parliament, places where it would have been inconceivable even a few months ago that the phrase Black Lives Matter would ever be vocalized. I have many thoughts and that I'd be happy to share in Q&A on what to make of this shift in discourse, which at least on its face seems to be a break from the racial aphasia I described at the start of my talk. But one of my hopes is that the interrogation of systemic racism that seems at least to be on the table in new ways today, including through the lens of human rights, will also be applied to borders and international migration. And so I will pause here and hope that you are still with me, and thank you for your patience in and letting me read for as long as I have. And hopefully, Andrew, we can now turn to Q&A.
Absolutely. Tendayi, thank you so much for such a fascinating lecture. I have to say, as a as a white European human rights scholar and defender, I feel your lecture is particularly very constructively unsettling, but nevertheless very unsettling. Raises a huge number of questions that need to be addressed now. I've been scrolling down a great many questions. I'm not going to exercise the chair's rather rude prerogative here and ask those, because we have questions literally streaming in. So if you're sitting comfortably, Tendayi, let's get to some of these.
Yeah, no, that's good.
So do you think it is better to theorize a response that emphasizes colonial powers' responsibility for their former territories, which then leaves them with a deciding power, or to mobilize the universal framework of human rights? If the latter, how in practice would you manage borders, if at all? An easy question to kick off.
Okay, and it's coming from Bronwyn Manby, whose work I really respect. Hi, Bronwyn. Glad that you're on the call. So I don't think that there's an either or here. I don't think you can theorize or mobilize the universal framework of human rights without engaging with the responsibilities of former colonial powers, because those former colonial powers have delivered to us and in many ways continue to structure what we describe as the universal framework of human rights. So it's not an either or. And, you know, when we think about what has been described by others as the coloniality of power, part of it is to think about the responsibilities and obligations of former colonial powers. Another is to think about the broader structure of benefit allocation that is made possible by those former colonial powers, right? So we might think about other imperial projects that I haven't discussed about, or other imperial hegemons that I haven't talked about, like China, for example, which is not a European colonial power, but that definitely participates in the global system, sometimes relying upon structures that came out of colonialism, sometimes relying on others. So I think the goal or the focus for me is that we cannot speak about a universal framework of human rights without acknowledging the ways that the framework to this day continues to reflect hierarchies that are colonial. And I'll give you a very concrete example. In my work as special rapporteur, when I go into a country and we're talking about racial discrimination, everyone wants to talk about explicit individualized acts of prejudice and intolerance, and less so about systemic structures of racial subordination and oppression. We can't divorce, I think, that move from thinking about structure to thinking about individuals from liberalism and from its histories and from its present, in a way that means it's not an either or, both have to happen. And if what you're looking for is racial justice and racial equality, that cannot happen without a reparative intervention that seeks to undo structures of injustice that we never have. So I think that the goal is to think about the two approaches as necessarily symbiotic rather than as an either or, and to think about that in the context of borders as well. So maybe not the most satisfactory answer, but I see it as not an either or.
Thank you, Tendayi. Let me just follow up on that. Some of my own work has been similarly critical of the liberal framework and a series of liberal complacencies within the normative and the institutional framework. However, I'm also I'm very sensitive to how uncomfortable that can be for many of our colleagues, many of our students who identify liberalism perhaps in a different way to those that see liberalism as a kind of contaminated by neoliberal forces, for example, but see liberalism as a positive force, see liberalism as a force that human rights is fundamentally dependent upon. Does that ever cross it crosses my mind frequently when I'm engaging with liberals on these kinds of issues. Is that a concern for you in respect of racial justice and just how complacent liberals and liberalism has been surrounding the perpetuation of systemic racial injustice?
Yeah, you know, my own approach is that there should be no framework, no theory, no ideology that is not subject to critical interrogation. And there is no perfect or ideal frame out there. If there was, I think we would already have moved, towards it. I think there are I often think about this. I think there are more and less brutal forms of empire, and we want to work towards the less brutal forms of empire. At least that's what I think the goal should be. But what can be pernicious, I think, about the kind of liberal posture is this above reproach and the belief that equality has already been achieved in ways that actually undercut the process of getting where you need to go. And, you know, liberalism's, and here we're talking in generality, right? And there's many people who use the frame of liberalism. Even in my own work in Migration as Decolonization, I concede that the moves that I consider decolonial that I'm making are still very much within the liberal frame, right? So I don't want to act as though the liberals are somewhere out there. I think you take and use what you can for emancipation's purposes. But it's, to me, I'm dissatisfied by a failure to reckon again with colonialism, its contemporary legacies, and how the language of equality and non-discrimination itself can become a part of obscuring fundamental structures of subordination, you know? And so in the context of borders, you'll see that there can be a universal condemnation of an actor like Donald Trump and, say, Viktor Orban, because they explicitly articulate ethno-nationalist visions of their nations. But then a reticence to call out the fact that the European Union or the Obama administration have basically overseen border regimes that realize visions that are ethno-nationalist de facto, even if not, you know, by stated purpose. And so to me, we have to grapple with both. And if you are a staunch believer in the liberal project, then I think the burden is on you to talk about how that liberal project can be meaningful to racially subordinated groups. Because if it can't, then we're right back to that world where you have Theodore Roosevelt saying everyone has freedom of movement, but in actual fact, it's on a racial basis.
It's a great answer. I love that answer. Thank you so much. So questions are pouring in. I'll get to some from colleagues. I was struck by how the history of passport privileging and racialized borders would have interacted with foreign investment law protections to reinforce the economic dominance of those in power, starting in the 1800s, but continuing even now. As part of your mandate, have you or will you look at how these racialized borders interact with international economic law?
Yeah, so as part of my mandate, it's interesting. I'm thinking about the work that I've done as UN Special Rapporteur, and then the work that I do in my academic capacity. And sometimes, you know, moving between the two can feel a little bit like being in two entirely separate universes. And it's been interesting to try and think about how one does some of the decolonial work I find myself invested in the framework of a UN mandate that is, you know, I think of the UN as one of the ground zeros of systemic racism. It is an institution itself that has not fully decolonized, and it's not even clear that it could fully decolonize and remain a United Nations. But I think there's definitely really important work to be done here. And you might think about it in the context of labor migration and how labor migration is so fundamentally racialized. You know, I did a country visit to this. I don't know if this will be responsive to your question, Tara, but I'm just going to tell you some thoughts that come to my mind that are based on your question. I did a country visit to the Kingdom of Qatar, where, you know, 90% of the population is foreign nationals, and you have de facto kind of national origin caste systems where people come from specific countries and have salaries and visas that are tied to specific roles, and you see kind of a racial hierarchy in terms of the labor that you perform and the money that you are paid to perform that. And it's very stark in ways that I would argue are, say, reproduced even in the United States. So in the context of the COVID pandemic, for example, many of you will know that many borders have been shut down in ways that most people aren't being allowed to move. But there's been discussions in different parts of the world, and there was a discussion here in the US about allowing agricultural workers from Central America to be able to come in, to be able to harvest crops, but to do so at even lower wages than they would have done prior to the pandemic. I say all of this to highlight the fact that economic systems and economic value extraction is racialized, and that borders often do the work of sustaining the racialization of economic extraction without the word race ever being mentioned, because again, nationality and national origin can function as such powerful proxies. And so I'm grappling with how this is articulated in the context of my UN mandate. In my academic scholarship, I'm thinking about how, even visa categories are racialized and gendered in ways that have economic and racial implications, but that we don't often grapple with. But I think the bottom line, again, is to bring conversations about race to conversations about border, and then very much center economies and economic law as fundamentally implicated as well.
Thank you, Tendayi. Let me follow up with a similar question. The apparent withdrawal from globalization and open borders has been ramped up politically, yet the economic tentacles of global corporations reinforce the benefits of globalization from a Western supremacist perspective. I would argue that this is a kind of conscious asymmetry which underpins the racism of borders. Do you agree?
Yes, I do agree. I think it's very much a conscious asymmetry, and I think there's people who've written about this asymmetry in really powerful ways, like Chantel Thomas, who's a professor at Cornell and whose work in general I recommend on borders. And I would just qualify the asymmetry and say, and this is part of what my lecture was about, we often talk about, goods can move, but people can't. And the people not being able to move, it's not, some people can move and others cannot. It will depend on the nature of your passport. It'll depend on your race, your gender, your class. So part of the pushback, I think, also has to be that it's not just that international mobility or the mobility of goods far outpaces the mobility of people, but it's that when people move, even that movement itself is racialized, and there's a different allocation of benefits of who can and who cannot move. And this is not to say that the solution is, free movement of people and free movement of goods. I think the economic system, the capitalist economic system that structures our world right now is fundamentally racialized in ways that people who study racial capitalism have written about. And so the solution won't just be to open borders for people to move more. The solution will be to rethink economic structures in ways that don't rely on racial subordination as a kind of means of extracting value. And so, I think of myself as a migration scholar, a borders scholar, but more and more I feel like this is just tinkering with the surface. Really what we have to be studying is the way we organize our societies politically and economically, because borders are very much a function of that. And if what you care about is more just borders, really what you care about is more just economic and political communities and interconnection as well.
Thank you. Can I follow up with I'm going to use chair's prerogative or host prerogative here on that. So my own background is in critical theory, various forms of neo-Marxism, particularly critical of capitalism and the way in which capitalism has generated certain institutions and norms that reinforce itself more or less effectively. Much of that tradition, however, is largely absent of addressing the racialization of capitalism. I mean, it's kind of mea culpa, as it were, but why do you think that is? Why is it that academia has been so guilty of aphasia and simply just a blindness to what should be patently obvious to anyone who's taken a critical perspective upon
I think about this all the time. I mean, on the topic of kind of Marxism and its engagement with race, I would recommend the work of somebody like Rob Knox. I can't even pretend to be somebody who's sufficiently sophisticated in that scholarship to kind of weigh in, but I think his work, he has an article in the London Review of Books, I think, where he really speaks to exactly this intersection, where is the race piece in the Marxist critique at the international law level. But I think a lot about international law. I studied international law with very little awareness of its racialized history and present, and actually even with very little engagement with its relationship to the international economy. And I studied, with people who I think are understood to be the leaders in the field. And so we ask ourselves, how can there be this persisting racial aphasia? I think part of it is that international law is the law of empire. It is a very kind of, it is an elitist field that is predominantly white and male in many ways, that mean that the lived experience of racial and gendered subordination, I think, becomes abstract in ways that they cannot be for somebody who is living the subordination that we're describing. So this seems trivial, but I think the demographics are part of why the field has the racial aphasia that it has. And then I think it's because, and then there's a whole host of other reasons. I think some of it is the kind of denialism, the desire to want to already live in a world where equality has been achieved, and an inability to concede that it could be the very foundations of the project we're committed to. That's where the kind of rotten seeds lie, right? That it requires just a complete rethinking rather than a kind of adding a layer on the top that would solve all of the problems. It's not clear to me. So at the end of my talk, I mentioned this, you know, the transnational movement that we're experiencing of, you know, Black Lives Matter. And I've been following this in the UN context, where there was an urgent debate about the situation in the US and in other parts of the world on systemic racism. And for many who were involved in the urgent debate in the Human Rights Council, it was an unprecedented fact that we were in the Human Rights Council discussing systemic racism in 2020, because it just seemed really impossible. But then as the debate proceeded, so it started off very strong, and there was there was a proposal on the table for a resolution that would establish a commission of inquiry to investigate the situation, and we ended up with a much watered down resolution. And to me, what was clear was that many of the actors, the most powerful actors within the UN, which are also the countries that have the deepest problems with systemic racism, are not willing to remake themselves. They are not willing to remake themselves on more equitable terms. And so without that unwillingness, you know, it's hard to know how deep this will really go. So I see a shift in rhetoric, but I'm still waiting to see whether within global institutions, there will be a willingness to kind of reflect at the level that implicates the institutions, the way they function, the way they teach. You know, even our law schools, right? I mentioned this, we teach human rights. I remember when I taught human rights for the first time, looking for a textbook that focused on racial justice and ICID was really, really hard. They were just difficult to find. Why is that? It's not a priority, I suppose, for human rights scholars. So anyway, this is a very winding way to say there are many different reasons. One of them, I think, has to do with who's in positions of authority, what those people's lived experiences are. And systemic racism is about the exclusion, including from positions and places of authority, of the people whose lives, I think, mean they cannot have the luxury of racial aphasia.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Okay, so more questions. Thank you very much for such an inspirational talk. How transformative can the Global Compact on Migration and similar documents truly be, considering that governments adopted it at a time of rising xenophobia in so many countries? Shouldn't we infer that governments didn't really mean much with the compact's fine words?
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, I completely relate to that skepticism. You know, if you look at the Global Compact on Migration, the very first objective, which you might think is the objective that, you know, sets the groundwork, is actually about data collection. And it essentially basically says we need to be gathering more data. And you basically see it's like an opening up of the surveillance of migrants in a way that I find truly terrifying. So I don't want to seem naive about what the Global Compact is. But I think that we shouldn't be naive about any international instruments, right? So this is a kind of strange, pessimistic call to say there is no pure international document. So I'm a very big fan of the International Convention for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, a document that was adopted in 1965, I think, at a time when, you know, much of the world was still under colonial domination, at a time when first world countries were deeply opposed to the adoption of that treaty, and where there were really big fights about things that we now accept as basics. Think about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is, you know, 1945 or 48, sorry that I've forgotten, it's been a really long night.
Yeah,
48, right? Yeah. And that's before the Civil Rights Act has been passed in the United States. So Eleanor Roosevelt is at the UN saying all humans are free and equal. Meanwhile, in the US at that time, you know, you have a deeply formally segregated country. So the Global Compact, I see it in those terms as well. Yes, it is the product of flawed processes that are fundamentally structured by geopolitics, but that doesn't necessarily tell us the full story about their possible emancipatory potential, you know? And when I think about the emancipatory potential of human rights, to me, it is very much contingent on whose voices and whose experiences give life or animate the principles that we have. This is not to say that there may not be aspects of the human rights framework that will never get us the full way. It's not to say that the language of human rights isn't sometimes part of the problem, but rather it is to say that there are no clean hands and there are no clean instruments. There's just human beings who can do better or worse things with the instruments that they have. So I would hope that in 50 years, we will have a more powerful multilateral instrument that helps us think about migration and borders than the Global Compact on Migration. At the same time, it's hard for me to say to anybody, you should just ignore that instrument because, people are dying today. And I'm definitely in the camp that thinks we use the instruments that we have to mitigate suffering to the extent that we can, even as we remain invested in a more radical future time when we will have, more perfect normative articulations of the goals that we're working towards. So I want to have my cake and eat it, essentially.
Don't we all? Don't we all? Tendayi, I have to say it's very refreshing to hear an international lawyer speaking in such overtly political terms. Do you think that can that be problematic for the Human Rights Project if it becomes overtly politicized? Some of the impetus for, we know that many activists, many students, many scholars even see human rights in very primarily moral terms rather than politicized terms. Introducing a political context can to some look like it's suggesting contingency, compromise, lack of certainty about one's own commitments and values. Are you comfortable with going down that route, if that's the route that I'm correctly attributing to you?
So I guess I would push back a little bit and say that to me, there is nothing apolitical about the human rights frame, absolutely nothing apolitical about it. And that even those who claim to speak of the frame as one that operates in purely moral terms are expressing a fundamental political, that's a political move right there, right? So you'll have people who say, for example, that civil and political rights should be privileged over economic, social, cultural rights. That's a very political stake to have, or to even say we have to assert a universality in principle that is not a universality in practice. That is a very political move to make. And I think of politics as being about conversations about the distribution of power, right? That to me is one way we might think about what political means. I'm not talking about a kind of partisanship. And sometimes I think people think that's what politics means. You're expressing kind of affiliation to one political party and its norms and whatever. I'm thinking about political in a much bigger sense, which is kind of tracking power and its distribution. And I think the real mistake is to act as though there are ways of intervening using the human rights framework that are apolitical and those that are politicized, where the apolitical are the mainstream and dominant, when the political, economic, and social ramifications of that are felt differentially and in ways that exclude the individuals that want to claim this kind of apolitical sense of what the framework is doing. So when I teach my students human rights, what I'm saying to them is, for any human rights intervention, for any kind of normative proclamation, what is the political accounting or the social accounting that is made real by adopting that perspective, right? And that should be the question. And if you ask that question, you ask about the universe or the world that is created by a particular perspective. So let's say you say you want to talk about universal human rights and you want to talk about them in a so-called apolitical way. What are the implications for that for racially subordinated groups? If the implications are that they don't get the kinds of interventions that are necessary, then that's a vote in favor of a kind of a white supremacist social order, and you have to own that. So I'm more invested in a political and a social accounting of laws interventions, and then a conversation about which accounting speaks to better or worse outcomes more or less just outcomes, rather than saying we should be avoiding politics because they contaminate law. And this, and one final, you see, I could go on a sermon about this, like they have so many thoughts about here, but this move to think of law as an apolitical project, I would say, is central to the method of positivism, right? And for those of you who are on this call who haven't read Anthony Anghie's powerful intervention, Imperialism, Sovereignty, and the Making of International Law, he talks about the rise of positivism and this divorcing of law from politics in a way that essentially is an instrument, like it is instrumental in colonial subordination. It comes with a politics. And so we think our methods don't matter, but our methods serve specific politics. And we owe it, I think, as academics, as different people who may be teaching other people or leading other people in these ways, to truly account for the politics and the worlds that are made real, even by statements that we think of as purely moral or anything like that.
It's a fascinating answer. Thank you. We could discuss it for hours, but there are questions that we should get to. Wonderful lecture. As I'm working in Mexico on issues of Black, Haitian, and African migration into and through Mexico and anti-Blackness they experience, I'm particularly curious what thoughts you have about Afro-descendancy in Latin America and mobilization in support of their rights as distinct minorities within colonial, colonial European and indigenous contexts. Intersects with, impacts, etc., anti-Blackness against migrants in those Latin American countries, and what possibilities you see for collaboration and working together among Afro-descendant and Black migrant groups, and to promote their human rights collectively in those countries. Sorry, that was I took a couple deep breaths there. It's a long question, but.
Yeah, no, it is, and it's a very rich question. Also, I have to say to everyone who's sending in questions, this is really fun. Sometimes you're on a Zoom call and you get all kinds of questions and they don't allow you to get into the deep and juicy stuff, but I'm really appreciating how thoughtful and really difficult many of the questions that are coming through. But before I answer that question, I will say that, my lecture focused on a particular kind of system of racial supremacy. I've focused on white supremacy. And I want to just, before I answer the question, say that there are other racial supremacist empires and projects out there, right, that operate sometimes side by side with white supremacy, but sometimes that aren't necessarily only or fundamentally about that. Some of it might be articulated in religious terms. You might think about the kind of Hindu supremacist ideologies that are salient, for example, right now in India, that are resulting in violations that are really, really extreme, and that overlap, I think, with some of the colonial projects that I've been describing. But I do want to mark the fact that you can have other ways of thinking and talking about racial supremacy and kind of race as a structure that aren't tied to the particular colonial and imperial projects that have been the center of my analysis. And now to move specifically to this question. So, I'm not an expert on Latin America, and I'm trying to learn more about the region. Much of my work focuses on Africa and Europe, and as an African, I feel like that's the imperial corridor that I'm native to, and it's been easier to talk and write about that. But in speaking to Haitians specifically, and Haitian refugee and migrant communities, and hearing about their experiences throughout Latin America and the kind of undisputed anti-Blackness that characterizes their mobility in that region, either as anti-Blackness that manifests as exclusion, right, where they're being kicked out of places, and you might think about the DR in this way, or subordinate inclusion, where they're being included but on very subordinate terms, and where their race, their Blackness, is kind of determining that subordinate inclusion, is something that is truly profound. And I've been connecting it, or trying to connect it, to the history of Haiti itself, right? And the long history of Haitian migration, and Haiti as a site of kind of Black revolution that was so deeply threatening to the global order, in the 1800s, in ways that I don't think international lawyers necessarily fully reckon with now. But anyway, all of this rambling is to say, I think that there is something, the level of kind of justice and humanitarianism, there is a lot of work that needs to be done to grapple with anti-blackness in Latin America and to relate it to anti-blackness in other parts of the world. And I think the frames of, you know, transatlantic slavery and colonialism really allow for that kind of transnational analysis. I think there's a lot of work to be done there. And in my experience as a special rapporteur, my engagements with anti-racism groups in Latin America have been some of the most profound and powerful, you know, like the Brazilian Black feminist movements, you know, Afro-Colombian movements that work hand in hand with indigenous movements as well to kind of articulate in the language of human rights a racial justice critique that far eclipses anything that I see when I'm in Geneva, but is excluded from Geneva because of the way that power works. I think there's a lot of work to be done to bring knowledge being produced there to the global stage and then to connect it to other parts of the world. I do think also for international lawyers and for legal theorists, there is a lot of work to be done to grapple with the way that legal institutions, legal discourse, and human rights discourse fail to name anti-blackness in the context of migration. Like when I think about Haitian, the accounts that I get of the treatment of Haitian migrants in so many different parts of the world, their exclusion, discrimination, subordination is so fundamentally racialized and yet is so rarely named and engaged with as such. And so a lot of work to be done there. There's a group here in Southern California called Haitian Bridges to Alliance, which is a really powerful group that's trying to produce knowledge about the experience of Haitian refugees by Haitian refugees and migrants themselves. And so I think there's people obviously doing this work, but it needs to be more central to how we think and talk about borders from a human rights perspective.
Thank you, Tendayi. After a long question, here's a shorter one. This has come on the chat, and thank you so much to Stephen, who's been waiting patiently for an answer. His question is: your focus on racial aphasia might perhaps include economic aphasia and the cost to first world societies? Question mark. Short and sweet.
Yeah, I mean, I think the two can go hand in hand. I think the reason why I focus less on, so I think when we're talking about human rights, yes, I think that the neglect of the economy and economic factors and even socioeconomic rights, or at least a kind of marginalization of those ways of understanding what human rights can and should do, are very much related to and overlap with the racial aphasia. I think a lot more work is required there. And I think there's people who've written really interesting about this. And you might think about the shift to thinking about development, for example, and the many different ways in which economics are taken out of the realm of human rights and placed elsewhere. But I think from a legal perspective, I'm more stunned by a willingness to engage with economic dynamics, right? So I would say there's a fairly robust legal literature on international economic law, right? But even in that context, race is left out. So I think depending on which field you're in, it's true, the racial aphasia and economic aphasia can go hand in hand. In some spaces, there can be a willingness to engage with the economic and with class as though that fully exhausts issues to do with race as well. And this maybe goes back to your earlier point that you were making, Andrew, about kind of even Marxist critiques that will talk about the economy, but not necessarily go into race.
Indeed. We had several questions that were focused upon COVID and effects upon BAME communities in particular. I'm just going to take one that sort of brings most of them together. How should countries balance between protecting public health during this pandemic, yet to avoid being racist in their border migration policies?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so, you know, it's so interesting. I think what we're seeing with the COVID pandemic is we're seeing very vividly how national security threat is fundamentally racialized, you know, and other people have made this point over and over again, how the way we think about national security and the things that are threats to national security carry with them a fundamentally racial dimension to it. And there's a series right now on just security that's being edited by Matiange Sirleaf that I would recommend for people who are interested in this intersection between kind of race and national security. And you know, one example of this pre-COVID would be the fact that in much of the first world, terrorism is equated with Islamic extremism in ways that mean extreme right-wing terrorist acts that are, rooted in neo-Nazism and other doctrines of white supremacy. The machinery just hasn't been mobilized in ways that can grapple with those sources of national security threat, which are very prevalent right now. And in my work as Special Rapporteur, it's been interesting to watch states scramble to deal with white nationalist national security threats that have been completely written out of their policies, that have been focusing on a very racialized understanding of what national security is like. But to come back to borders, I'm reminded of what was happening in this country right as the pandemic was setting in, and as everybody was realizing what was about to happen. It was the virus was very much being firmly associated with China, and the president of the US has continued to do that. But some of the reports that were coming out at the time was that at airports, people who were coming from China, or people who looked Chinese, so if you looked Asian American, you were more likely to be stopped for secondary screening at the airports than irrespective of where you're coming from. So there was a kind of racial profiling in enforcement of the immigration restriction. When at the time, and it later came out that for New York, for example, the strain that was most dominant was coming from Italy. So it was Europe. And so you would have people who were coming in from Europe who were kind of being not subject to the secondary screening, not being interrogated about where they had been and whether they were going to self-isolate. But the policing of the borders were falling back on racialized tropes in ways that were contradictory to any kind of national security concerns, right? You're trying to solve a pandemic. What you should be thinking about is who's likely to have it based on where they were rather than on their national origin. All of this is to say, I think, in the COVID pandemic response, it's going to be essential to interrogate the racialized foundations of national security and to ensure that those aren't being ignored as governments are structuring their policies. Even as governments are moving towards, say, for example, employing technologies and using kind of surveillance and tracking and all of these different ways of trying to keep up with the pandemic, many of those technologies have come under fundamental critique about operating on a racially and ethnically disparate basis, right? But they're being rolled out in the pandemic context in ways that fail to account for how racialization is built into the tech and can operate even in the absence of any kind of racist intent on the part of the deployer of the tech. So all of this is to say, I'm not very hopeful that we are going to see just or more just border regimes emerging in the context of the pandemic. And I actually see instead the racialization of borders and the racialization of national security actually undercutting truly genuine public health interventions. And that's a fear. That's a fear that I have, that I think might be being borne out as we speak.
Thank you, Tendayi. Can you take one more question? I'm very conscious that we're getting close to the hour and a half that we had kind of allocated provisionally. Can you take one more?
Yes, absolutely.
So this is from one of our many alumni from TAI. So thank you, TAI, and hello to all of our alumni wherever you are. It's good to see you all. So thank you for your inspiring lecture. I often find that the so-called international human rights field, including UN, universities, and NGOs, are, in inverted commas, racialized post-colonial, meaning that it's dominated by Western cultures, and you often have to adopt to such cultures to be accepted, though they require people to have an ability to work in a multicultural environment. In fact, it means a non-Westerner's ability to Westernize themselves, but not the other way around. How can we deconstruct this structural barrier so that the international human rights field will fully incorporate racial justice values? Such an excellent question. That's why I kind of saved it for last.
Yeah. I mean, that person should have maybe given the lecture. I think they've really put the challenges and the issues really, really well. And I think those criticisms are absolutely valid. I'm stunned at the number of meetings, convenings I'm at, even within the UN, where it's just, the racial and ethnic dimensions or dynamics of the demographics are stunning, given that it's supposed to be a global institution, and then also seeing kind of where people of color dominate and looking at the power structure. It's to me truly, truly appalling. how do we create change? You know, I think the kind of change I am most interested in is the change that I feel I have the most control over, and that's at the level of kind of how we're teaching human rights, who our students are, and how we're mentoring them to take these kinds of positions in the future. And I think in this moment when there is a professed commitment to thinking about systemic racism, I think it creates an opportunity for alums such as yourself to be putting pressure, say, for example, on Essex. I have no idea what the demographics are like at Essex, but you know, I'm at a law school, and I've been in law school institutions where I'm going to just venture to say that more could be done. More could be done to diversify the student body, more could be done to diversify the faculty bodies. And by diversify, it's not just about tokenism. It's about being open to different ways of producing knowledge, different ways of being and thinking within the academy. I feel like I've had the good fortune of having a number of mentors who allowed me to remain mostly myself and do this work. Most people are not lucky. You go through law school, you may have come to law school as somebody who was fairly radical, and you come out a lawyer who's, you know, committed to the system as it is, you know, and maybe have never even visited a prison, so you don't even know what the criminal justice system actually even really does in practice. So I would say, I think, to me, one of the urgent places where we should be fighting these battles is in our universities and on our curricula and in places like that, because you can't expect transformation at the highest levels if you can't transform the feeders. And for many institutions like the UN, there are reliable places from which people are coming to take those jobs. And so the work is hard. There's so many different ideas one might have, but I do want to highlight the role of academic institutions and the urgency of transforming not just their composition, but the way they produce knowledge and how they understand themselves as implicated in sustaining structures of systemic racism.
Thank you. Such an excellent. The convention obviously is to say thank you so much for such a fascinating, inspiring lecture. But no, truly, your vision, I think, on these absolutely essential issues is second to none. There have been many comments, as you would have seen, I'm sure, thanking you for the lecture and just how inspiring it is. I think what you have shown today is how much of a struggle we all have ahead of us as human rights scholars, as human rights educators, practitioners, activists, as people who care about social justice. What that truly means now, I think, has the bar for achieving that has been raised or changed, I think, in highly challenging ways. And I say, as I said earlier, just how constructively unsettling these kinds of messages are. But I can't thank you enough for giving up your time, for sharing your expertise and your vision with us. So thank you so much on behalf of the entire Human Rights Centre community, which is large and global. Thank you. I'd also like to thank
you for having me. It really was a real pleasure. I was saying this to Andrew while we were offline. It's a pleasure to be able to reflect on some of these harder questions when so much of my time these days is spent responding to kind of urgent fires. So thank you so much for the opportunity. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. I also need to thank the people who really made this happen. So Catherine Gentry and Sophie Conlon ensured that the event was advertised very fully and that all the technical stuff went smoothly. I mean, I'm relieved that it went so smoothly. We also have colleagues in the Communications and External Relations Department, Stephen Matthews in particular, who is involved in advertising and publicizing this particular event. And obviously to all of you, wherever you are, some of you, as I say, it's probably long past your bedtime if you're much further east. Thank you so much for joining us. Tendayi, thank you. Let's stay in touch. I'm sure our students would love to receive your slides for this lecture, references you may have to share. We of course can discuss that in due course. But so absolutely. Just remains for me to say thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day, your evening, or get a good night's sleep.
Thank you.
Take care.